had shown future generations that it was possible to live in the open air. The day the Golden Horde died was not the day its last army was defeated. It was the day its power over the minds of its subjects was shattered forever. That day was the 8th of September, 1380, on the blood-soaked ground of Kulikovo Field. Every great nation has a foundational myth, a story told and retold until it becomes the bedrock of its identity. For Russia, that story was forged in the fire and fog of a single autumn day in the year 1380. It is a story of a battle fought on a desolate field against an enemy that was considered not just a military power, but a law of nature. The enemy was the Golden Horde, the western heir to the Mongol Empire, a political and military behemoth that had held the Rus lands in a state of vassalage for nearly 250 years. The battle was Kulikovo. This was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of destinies. It was the moment a collection of fractured, bickering principalities, conditioned by centuries of submission, gambled everything on a desperate, unified act of defiance. They were led by a prince from a city that had itself grown powerful through cunning subservience, a city called Moscow. On that day, on that field, the Muscovite prince, Dmitry Ivanovich, would lead his people in a brutal, sacrificial, and world-altering struggle. This is the story of that struggle, not just of how a battle was won, but of how a nation's soul was awakened. The Mongol yoke was a system of remarkable sophistication. Following the devastating invasions of the 13th century, the Golden Horde chose not to occupy the vast forested lands of the Rus. Instead, they governed by proxy, turning the Rus' princes into the instruments of their own subjugation. The annual tribute was the most tangible symbol of this relationship, a constant flow of wealth from the subjugated to the sublime court of the Khan at Sarai. But the true genius of the system was political. The Khan held the exclusive power to grant the patent, or Yarlik for the title of Grand Prince, the most senior position in the Rus' hierarchy. This single mechanism fostered a culture of endemic rivalry and betrayal among the Rus' elite. Princes would journey to the Horde's capital not to plead for their people's freedom, but to undermine their rivals and secure the Khan's favor for themselves. This brilliantly simple policy kept the Ruses politically fragmented and militarily weak, ensuring that no single prince could ever become powerful enough to challenge the Horde's authority. Any deviation from this established order was met with swift and terrifying violence. A punitive raid that would reset the balance of fear and reaffirm the Horde's absolute power. Within this framework of calculated oppression, the Principality of Moscow began a slow and methodical rise. Moscow's princes were political realists. They understood that open defiance was suicide. Instead, they pursued a strategy of exemplary loyalty. They became the Khan's most dependable vassals, his most efficient tribute collectors. This loyalty earned them the Khan's trust, which they leveraged to expand their own territory and influence, often at the expense of their more rebellious neighbors. Moscow was patiently building a centralized state, using the authority of the Horde as its primary tool of construction. It was a long, patient game of gathering the scattered sticks of Rus's power into a single bundle, strong enough to one day break the back of its own master. The moment to act arrived when the master's house fell into disorder. The late 14th century was a period of intense crisis for the Golden Horde. A series of civil wars and coups, known as the Great Troubles, fatally weakened its central authority. The once monolithic empire began to show its seams. It was this perceived weakness that emboldened the Grand Prince of Moscow, Dmitry Ivanovich. Dmitry was of a new breed of Rus's leader, one who saw the Horde not as an eternal force, but as a wounded giant. He began to govern with an unprecedented autonomy, directly challenging the authority of the Horde's de facto ruler, the powerful general and usurper Mamai, whose own power was precarious due to his lack of a legitimate Genghisid bloodline, could not afford to tolerate such insubordination. When Dmitry's forces defeated a Mongol army at the Vozha River in 1378, it was a public humiliation that demanded a massive response. Mamai gathered an enormous host, intending to make an example of Moscow that would terrify the Rus back into a century of submission. He forged alliances with Moscow's traditional enemies, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Principality of Ryazan, planning a three-pronged attack that would ensure the complete annihilation of the Muscovite army. Faced with these overwhelming odds, Dmitry made a decision of shocking audacity. He chose not to wait for the enemy to converge upon him. Instead, he mobilized his own forces and marched south deep into the steppe to seek a decisive battle with Mamai alone. In a final dramatic act, he led his army across the River Don, cutting off any possibility of retreat. This was a battle for absolute stakes. He was signaling to his men and to the world that they would either emerge from this field as the masters of their own destiny, or they would not emerge at all. The Battle of Kulikovo began with a moment of high drama. As the two armies faced each other across the misty field, a Tatar champion, Chelubey, rode forth to issue a challenge. He was answered by a Russ's warrior monk, Alexander Peresvet. Their duel was a violent, symbolic clash of two ideologies, the Horde's belief in martial prowess versus the Russ's burgeoning sense of spiritual mission. In a single furious charge, both men were killed, a grim foreshadowing of the mutual slaughter to come. Following this, Prince Dmitry performed his own act of symbolic commitment, trading his commander's armor for that of a common soldier and taking his place in the front ranks. Then the battle proper began. It opened with the classic Mongol tactic of a massive arrow storm, designed to soften and terrorize the enemy lines, followed by a thunderous charge of heavy cavalry aimed directly at the heart of the Russ's army. The Russ's line, a dense formation of infantry, absorbed the initial shock in a brutal, grinding melee. For hours, the battle was a desperate, close-quarters affair, a contest of pure endurance and courage. The Russ's center, bearing the brunt of the assault, was slowly worn down, and when the main princely banner finally fell, the line began to waver on the verge of a complete rout. Seeing the battle tipping in his favor, Mamai committed his final reserves to deliver the decisive blow. It was in this moment of seeming victory that the hidden genius of Dmitry's plan was unleashed. An elite regiment of fresh Russ's cavalry, which had been concealed in a forest on the flank, burst forth from its hiding place and slammed into the exposed rear of the charging Tatar army. The surprise was total, and its effect was devastating. The Horde's attack collapsed into chaos as they were suddenly assailed from two directions at once. The psychological shock shattered their morale. Mamai, watching his army disintegrate, fled the field in a panic. The Horde's retreat quickly turned into a rout, and the Russes, sensing a miraculous victory, pursued them with a vengeance, turning the battle into a one-sided slaughter. The victory at Kulikovo was a watershed moment, but it was not the final chapter. Just 2 years later, a new and legitimate Khan, Tokhtamysh, would brutally sack Moscow and restore the tribute, a harsh reminder of the Horde's enduring power. But the events of 1382, while tragic, could not erase the profound psychological transformation that had occurred at Kulikovo. The battle had permanently destroyed the myth of Mongol invincibility. It had demonstrated that a united Rus's army could not only stand against the Horde, but could decisively defeat it. This new knowledge, this new self-belief, became the ideological foundation for the future Russian state. Kulikovo created a new political reality, cementing Moscow's role as the leader and protector of the Russ's lands. It was the moment a shared national identity, forged in the heat of battle and sanctified by the blood of martyrs, began to take shape. The final throwing off of the Mongol yoke a century later was a direct consequence of the events of 1380. The quiet standoff at the Ugra River in 1480 was the political confirmation of a spiritual and military reality that had been established on Kulikovo field. The day the Golden Horde died was not a single event, but a process. It was a long, slow decline, but the fatal wound was struck on that foggy September morning. It was the day a people, through an act of supreme sacrifice and courage, willed themselves into a nation.